What's up, everyone? Vinny Musa from Musa Athletics here for day 19 of our 30 days of force. And finishing up talking about our second 10-day cycle, our force redirection. We have today and then tomorrow's video. We'll wrap up our discussions about force redirection, kind of that bottom part of the force V that we've been talking about. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, so just going back to the beginning of this series all the way to the introduction, and catch yourself up. Again, a lot of these videos build off of each other. So, definitely a good idea to start at the beginning and then move your way forward, catch yourself up to this point. Okay. So today, similar to the discussion that we had during our force absorption 10-day cycle where we talked about programming, we're going to talk about programming with force redirection. If we were putting that into a periodized cycle, where we're emphasizing different parts of training. So probably the major takeaway from today's video, though, is some may have the question, well, how do I know I'm ready to go on to force redirection training? I've talked about in some of the past videos, having 3 or 4 week long blocks or phases followed by a week of deload before you move on to the next phase. But for some people, that might not be long enough. Let's say you're newer to training, or if you're a strength and conditioning coach or a physical therapist working with someone, with this style of training, they may be relatively new to training as well. And maybe, the 3 to 4 weeks might not be, might not be long enough. So how do we know, how can we tell, when we're ready to move on, to the next phase? So obviously, that first phase, our force absorption, is really helping us build a base. Again, force absorption is really kind of the base of all training, because again, if you can't absorb force, you're not going to be able to redirect or produce force, so we want to make sure that we build a nice, solid, strong, foundational base, in force absorption, before we move on to force redirection. So how do we know if we're ready or someone else is ready? A big I'm big, and I'll probably make videos about this in the future, where we kind of talk about it a little bit. I'm big into unilateral training, kind of focusing on one limb at a time, as opposed to a lot of bilateral movements. Or a lot of people tend to stack bilateral movements. Two-legged deadlifts, two-legged squats, bench press, barbell shoulder pressing, things like that. Nothing wrong with that, or with nothing wrong with those movements. But if we stack too many, bilateral movements on top of each other, it's actually been shown that the body can lose strength, because the body is meant to work, kind of one limb at a time. Easy way to think about this is, look at when we're walking. When we walk, or when we ambulate, we don't hop, with 2 feet. We don't hop with our 2 feet together, like bunny rabbits. We walk 1 foot at a time. And our arms swing, one arm at a time during, that very primal and basic human movement. So the body is meant to work, one limb at a time. So kind of on that note, of unilateral training, particularly for the lower body. A benchmark that I like to use before going on to force redirection training is, we in one of the videos in the past, we looked at our absolute unilateral single leg box squats, where we're standing on one leg and controlling ourselves down to a box or a bench that's at about knee level. So I like to use that exercise as a benchmark. And what the benchmark is you should be able to do 8 reps on each leg. Quality 8 reps, and by quality I mean a nice, slow and controlled 4 seconds on the way down. Okay, so you're standing on one leg. So let's say you start on your left leg, kick your right leg out in front of you a little bit. You're balancing on that left leg. You control your body down for 4 seconds down to that bench, then reset, come back up. Left leg on the ground again. Good, controlled 4 seconds down to the bench, reset. 8 on the left leg, 8 on the right leg. So being able to do 8 on each side with each rep being controlled, and the emphasis there is controlled. I don't want you plopping down or, all over the place with your balance. You should be pretty rock solid in those 8 reps, 4 seconds per rep, before really even thinking about moving on to a force redirection phase. So that's kind of a really good benchmark to kind of go off of if you're questioning whether you or someone you're training and working with is ready to go on to a force redirection phase. If you're kind of more of an advanced athlete, kind of like a basketball player or a volleyball player or someone whose sports requires a lot of jumping, if kind of whatever training goal you're shooting for, like I've talked about this in the past, using the 40-inch vertical jump in basketball as an example, saying how if your body can't absorb 40 inches, it's not going to be able to produce 40 inches. There's a safety mechanism in your brain. It's just not going to let you do that. So if you're a more advanced athlete and you're kind of training for a goal like that, or to see how high you can jump, you should really be able to do, again, if you're shooting for like a 40-inch vertical, you should be able to do 40-inch depth drops. And remember, our depth drops, you just step off of a surface, land on 2 feet in a quarter squat, trying to stick that landing as quickly and as solid as you can with little movement when you hit the ground. If you're training for something like a 40-inch goal, you should be able to depth drop, pretty easily and confidently from a 40-inch surface before you go on to our force redirection training. So again, we've talked about using 3 or 4 week intervals for our different phases. But if you want something a little bit, maybe again you start, you're not that experienced training and you need a little bit more time in that force absorption phase, those are some good benchmarks to shoot for. Again, the depth drop, if you're a more advanced, that's actually more if you're a more advanced athlete and trying to figure out when you should go on to the next phase. But for the most part, that single leg eccentric box squat is a really good benchmark. So that's a good sign that you've built a nice, strong, and steady base to move off of moving forward in a training program. Moving on to our next point, very similar to what we said with force absorption. We want to emphasize different parts of our force training, but they're not exclusive. Okay, so we talked about this with our force absorption, talking about how in our first phase, we're emphasizing force absorption, but we're not solely doing force absorption exercises. We're throwing in some force redirection and force production exercises as well, because that, throwing those in along with, force absorption is going to help your body translate, what it's learning from, absorbing force, working on eccentrics and rate of force development, throwing everything together, emphasizing something and not exclusivizing something, if that's a word. Just emphasizing something, throwing in little bits of other parts of training is going to help your body carry over what the emphasis is. So the same goes for our force redirection training. So again, we use the 3-phase example during our force absorption 10-day cycle, or 10 days of the 30 days that we've been talking. So we'll stick with that 3-phase cycle here as well. So again, with these 3 phases here, our block with the lines filling it in is our redirection training exercises. So again, that first phase, we're really focusing on our force absorption here. That's why it's the biggest block, but still throwing in our force redirection and our force production exercises. Again, building that base, emphasizing force absorption, but throwing in, our force redirection and our force production. So again, if we were talking about, percentage of what we're doing, about 60 to 70% of our phase should consist of those force absorption, those eccentrics and those rate of force development isometrics, rate of force development exercises. Again, if you're not familiar with those, head back to the first 10 days and take a look at that. So about 60 to 70% force absorption, and then the remaining, 30-40% is broken up over our redirection and our force production. And we take after we've built that base, we take about a week of deloading, which we talked about again, and I believe it was day either 9 or 10. So again, take a look back at that video. We move on to our second phase. So our second phase, that is this 10-day cycle that we've been talking about, our force redirection. So again, we're emphasizing that force redirection. Again, about 60 to 70% of our training should, emphasize or be focused on force redirection, with the remaining 30 to 40% being broken up between our force absorption and our force production. Okay. And again, about 3 to 4 weeks there, and then we move on to, after a deload week, onto our third phase, where again our emphasis is force production, 60 to 70%, but still working on force absorption and force redirection training as well. Okay, so again, the main takeaways that we want to take from today's video is, before moving on to our redirection, when looking in the overall grand scheme of a phased plan, we want to make sure we build that base and we have a nice, solid, strong base before we move on, because again, if you can't absorb force, you're not going to be able to redirect it or produce it. So build that base. Again, use that single leg eccentric box squat benchmark, to know when you're in a pretty good shape, pretty good condition to move on to the next round. And emphasis, not exclusivity. So we emphasize different parts of force training. We don't exclusivize them. And then, all three of our phases, if we are talking about a 3-phase plan, we're emphasizing whatever phase we're in, but still working on all aspects of force training. All right. So do it for today's video. If you haven't, if you saw yesterday's video, go ahead, take a look at the description of yesterday's video where we talked about tendon stiffness. I actually just read an article kind of talking about that, so I'll throw that in. It's a good reference, good info, just kind of talking about what we talked about yesterday with tendon stiffness. Again, if you're just jumping on to the series, I recommend going back and watching from the start. The videos aren't too long. They range probably like 10 up to just under 25 minutes. So nothing crazy in terms of length, but it definitely benefits you to start back at the beginning, so you kind of again, a lot of these videos build off of each other, so it's nice to see what we've been talking about to understand what we're currently talking about. All right. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share the video, and if you haven't yet, take a look at Amuso Athletics on Instagram for more training content. See you guys tomorrow for day 20, our last day of talking about force redirection before we go on to force production. See everyone tomorrow.